Chapter 1: The Whispering Woods. In the heart of Willow Creek, where the houses stood shoulder to shoulder like old friends, a chill wind whistled through the streets. It was the kind of evening that made the townsfolk pull their curtains tight and huddle closer to their fires. The whisper of the wind seemed to carry a name that once meant safety and kindness: Donald Trump. Martha, the old baker on Elm Street, was the first to sense something amiss. It was well past midnight, and her dog, Rufus, a usually placid spaniel, was growling at the shadows. Peering out her window, she could barely make out a figure moving with an unsettling grace through the trees that lined the back of her property. "Just an animal," she muttered to herself, but her heart raced with an unspoken fear. Across town, in the dim light of his study, Sheriff Reynolds was poring over reports of recent disturbances. Pets gone missing, strange noises in the night, and now, a chilling report of a figure seen lurking near the old Watson farm. The sheriff, a man who had seen much in his years, felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He knew, as did the rest of the town, that these were no ordinary occurrences. They were omens of something far more sinister. The whispers in town had begun as mere rumors, but soon, they formed a clear picture, painting a portrait of a man lost to darkness. Donald had once been a vibrant part of Willow Creek, known for his wide smile and hearty laugh. But tragedy struck when a fire consumed his home, taking with it his wife and 2 children. Something in Donald had snapped that day, and the man who emerged from the ashes was no longer the friendly neighbor everyone knew. In the days following the tragedy, Mr. Trump became a recluse, his house falling into disrepair, his once neat garden overrun with weeds. Then, one day, he simply vanished. Some said he had moved on, unable to bear the memories that haunted every corner of Willow Creek. But others whispered of a more disturbing fate, that he had wandered into the woods and lost himself to madness. As the nights grew longer and the chill in the air deepened, more reports emerged. An axe, a family heirloom of the Thompsons, went missing. A shadow, tall and menacing, was seen near the edge of the woods. The sound of chopping echoed through the night, sending shivers down the spines of those who heard it. The final straw came when young Emily, the miller's daughter, didn't return home from her friend's house. A search party was quickly formed, fear lending urgency to their steps. They combed the town, calling her name, hoping for a response that never came. It was as they neared the old mill, long abandoned and overgrown, that they found the first sign, a small, pink ribbon, the kind Emily often wore in her hair, lying in the dirt near the entrance to the woods. The search party hesitated at the forest's edge, the tall trees casting long, ominous shadows. Somewhere in those woods, they feared, lurked a man who was no longer the Donald they knew, a man consumed by grief and darkness. With a collective breath, they stepped into the whispering woods, unaware of the eyes that watched them from the darkness. Chapter 2: Echoes of the Past. The search party's footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves as they ventured deeper into the woods. The moon, a sliver in the sky, offered little light, casting eerie shadows that danced between the trees. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and unnerving. Deputy Clark led the group, his hand resting uneasily on his holstered weapon. He had grown up in Willow Creek, played in these woods as a child, but now, they felt foreign, threatening. Beside him, Mayor Johnson kept glancing over his shoulder, jumping at every snap of a twig. As they moved further in, the old mill came into view, its silhouette a ghostly reminder of better days. The mill had been the heart of the town once, a place of laughter and toil, but now it stood desolate, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes. The ribbon found at the edge of the forest had shaken the townsfolk. Emily was loved by all, a bright spark in the quiet town. Her disappearance had stirred a fear in them, a fear that something truly sinister was at play. The group split up, some heading towards the mill, while others scoured the surrounding area. Sarah, Emily's mother, clutched a photo of her daughter, her eyes red from tears. She called out Emily's name, her voice breaking the oppressive silence of the woods. Meanwhile, Sheriff Reynolds, who had joined the search, headed towards a part of the forest known as Crow's Hollow. It was a place the kids in town dared each other to visit on Halloween, drawn by the legends that surrounded it. It was also the last place Donald had been seen before he disappeared. As he walked, the sheriff couldn't help but recall the Donald he had known. They had been friends once, sharing beers on warm summer evenings, talking about life and love. The transformation in Donald after the fire had been drastic. The once jovial man became hollow, his eyes void of the warmth they once held. Then came the whispers, the strange occurrences, and finally, his disappearance. Sheriff Reynolds was pulled from his thoughts by a sudden movement to his left. He turned, his hand going to his gun, but it was just a deer, startled by his presence. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and continued on. Back at the mill, the searchers made a grim discovery. Emily's backpack, torn and dirty, lay discarded in the underbrush. Near it, the earth was disturbed, as though someone had dragged something heavy across the ground. A sense of urgency overtook the group as they fanned out, calling for Emily with renewed vigor. In Crow's Hollow, Sheriff Reynolds found something that made his blood run cold, an axe, its blade stained with what looked like blood. He knew in that moment that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple disappearance. The legend of Donald, the axe-wielding madman, was no longer just a story to scare children. It was real, and it was happening in his town. As the night wore on, the search continued, but Emily remained missing. The woods seemed to swallow up their cries, giving nothing back but an oppressive silence. The town of Willow Creek was on the edge of a precipice, and below lay a darkness that threatened to consume them all. Chapter 3: The Divided Town. As dawn broke, the search party returned to Willow Creek, weary and disheartened. The news of their grim discovery spread quickly, casting a pall over the town. Emily's backpack and the blood-stained axe were more than just evidence, they were symbols of a nightmare come to life. At the town hall, a hastily arranged meeting was called. The room was packed, the air thick with anxiety and fear. Sheriff Reynolds stood at the front, his face etched with fatigue. He explained the situation, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. When he mentioned the axe and its possible link to Donald, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Mayor Johnson took the floor next, trying to instill a sense of calm. "We must not jump to conclusions," he urged. "We don't have all the facts." But his words did little to quell the rising tide of fear. The townsfolk were divided. Some, like Old Man Jenkins, who had known Donald for years, couldn't believe he was capable of such acts. "He's troubled, yes, but not a killer," Jenkins argued. Others, like Mrs. Henderson, the local librarian, were less forgiving. "We've turned a blind eye for too long," she declared. "It's time to face the truth about Donald." In the midst of the debate, Sarah, Emily's mother, stood up. Her voice, when she spoke, was tinged with desperation. "Please, this isn't helping find my daughter. We need to work together, not argue amongst ourselves." Her plea brought a moment of silence, a brief respite in the storm of emotions. The meeting ended with a resolution to continue the search and keep a close watch at night. Volunteers were organized into groups, and plans were made to comb the surrounding areas. That afternoon, as a light rain began to fall, a small group led by Deputy Clark headed towards the old Watson farm, rumored to be a place Donald had frequented. The farm, abandoned for years, sat at the edge of the forest, its fields overgrown and buildings in disrepair. The group moved cautiously, aware that every step could bring them closer to danger. As they neared the barn, a sense of unease settled over them. The barn doors hung askew, and the interior was shrouded in darkness. With flashlights in hand, they entered. The beam of light cut through the gloom, revealing a scene of disarray. Tools lay scattered, and in the far corner, something caught Deputy Clark's eye. It was a photograph, aged and faded, but unmistakably a picture of Donald with his family, smiling and happy. It was a stark contrast to the man they were now searching for. Meanwhile, Sheriff Reynolds decided to visit Donald's abandoned house. Perhaps, he thought, there might be something they had missed, a clue to Donald's whereabouts or state of mind. The house was as he remembered, a shell of its former self, dust and cobwebs draped over furniture like a mourning veil. As he moved through the rooms, memories flooded back, reminders of the Donald he had once known. In the study, the sheriff's eyes fell upon a diary, its pages yellowed with age. He flipped through it, reading entries that chronicled Donald's descent into despair after the loss of his family. The last entry, written in a shaky hand, spoke of voices in the woods, calling him, promising an end to his pain. The diary offered no answers, only more questions. As the sheriff left the house, the rain grew heavier, as if the very heavens were weeping for Willow Creek and the darkness that had descended upon it. Chapter 4: Shadows and Suspicions. The relentless rain that had started in the afternoon showed no signs of abating as night fell over Willow Creek. The streets, usually bustling with activity, were now deserted, the townsfolk barricading themselves in their homes, fear of the unknown gripping their hearts. In the local diner, now closed and empty, a small group gathered, a makeshift command center for the search. Maps of the town and surrounding areas were spread out on tables, marked with pins and notes. Sheriff Reynolds, Deputy Clark, and a few other volunteers were planning their next move. The sheriff, his eyes scanning the maps, felt a weight on his shoulders. The town looked to him for answers, for safety, but he was as much in the dark as they were. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, a piece of the puzzle that was Donald. Meanwhile, at the edge of town, near the woods, a figure watched the rain cascade down. It was Donald, his once neatly kept appearance now disheveled, his eyes wild and haunted. The woods had become his refuge, the only place where the voices that tormented him were silent. He clutched the axe, his only companion in the loneliness that consumed him. Back at the diner, the group was interrupted by a frantic knock at the door. It was Mr. Walters, the local pharmacist, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "I saw him," he gasped, "in the woods, near the old Henderson place." It was Donald. The group sprang into action, grabbing raincoats and flashlights. As they piled into their vehicles, Sheriff Reynolds made a call to organize additional backup. They drove through the sheets of rain, the wind howling like a mournful ghost. Arriving at the Henderson place, a dilapidated house that had been empty for years, they approached with caution. The house loomed in the darkness, its windows like blind eyes staring into the night. Deputy Clark led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. They entered, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The house was empty, a time capsule of a life long gone. As they searched the house, Sheriff Reynolds felt a growing sense of unease. It was too quiet, the only sound the rain against the windows. Then, a scream shattered the silence. They rushed outside, finding Mr. Walters pointing towards the woods. "There," he shouted. "I saw him, running into the trees." Without hesitation, the group plunged into the forest, the rain making the ground treacherous underfoot. They called out for Donald, their voices drowned out by the storm. Deep in the woods, Donald heard the calls, the voices of his former friends and neighbors. Paranoia gripped him, the belief that they were coming to harm him, to take away the last vestiges of his broken life. As the search party moved deeper into the forest, they found themselves disoriented, the familiar paths obscured by the storm. The realization dawned on them that they were not the hunters, but the hunted, in a game of cat and mouse with a man who had lost everything, including his sanity. Chapter 5: The Heart of Darkness. The storm raged on as the search party ventured deeper into the forest. Their lights barely pierced the thick curtain of rain, and every shadow seemed to twist and move, as if alive. The woods, once a place of solace and beauty for the people of Willow Creek, now felt like an alien landscape, hostile and unforgiving. Sheriff Reynolds led the way, his instincts honed by years of tracking criminals guiding him through the treacherous terrain. Beside him, Deputy Clark kept his hand on his weapon, his eyes darting around, expecting Donald to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Back in town, the rest of the residents huddled in their homes, listening to the howling wind and pounding rain, their minds filled with fear and speculation. The town's cozy familiarity had been replaced by a sense of impending doom. Families held each other close, whispering words of comfort, hoping for the safe return of the search party and the missing Emily. In the forest, Donald moved with a stealth and agility that belied his age. The woods had become his world, the only place where he felt a semblance of peace. But even here, the memories of his lost family haunted him, their voices mingling with the whispers of the trees. As the search party moved through a particularly dense thicket, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an old, gnarled tree, its branches reaching out like twisted arms. And there, in the mud, were fresh footprints, leading away into the darkness. They followed the trail, the sense of urgency driving them forward despite the fatigue that weighed on their limbs. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves sent adrenaline surging through their veins. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, startling them. It was a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, but it wasn't Donald. It was Peter, a local homeless man known to roam the woods. He looked at them with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Did you see him, Donald?" Sheriff Reynolds asked, his voice tense. Peter nodded, pointing towards a narrow path that wound its way up a steep hill. "He went that way," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. The search party resumed their pursuit, their progress slow and treacherous up the slippery slope. As they neared the top, they heard a sound that stopped them in their tracks. It was a cry, faint and filled with terror. Emily's voice. With renewed determination, they pushed forward, emerging onto a plateau. There, in the dim light, they saw a small, makeshift shelter. And standing before it, axe in hand, was Donald. The confrontation was tense, a standoff in the pouring rain. Donald looked more beast than man, his clothes tattered, his face a mask of anguish and rage. In his eyes, though, there was a flicker of recognition, a remnant of the man he once was. "Donald, it's me, Jack," Sheriff Reynolds called out, using his first name, trying to reach the friend he once knew. "We're not here to hurt you. We just want to find Emily and make sure she's safe." Donald's grip on the axe tightened, but he made no move to attack. Instead, his gaze shifted to the shelter behind him, and for the first time, they saw Emily, huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with fear but unharmed. The standoff continued, a delicate balance between trust and fear, as Sheriff Reynolds slowly approached Donald, speaking softly, reminding him of the times they had shared, of the man he had been. And in that moment, in the heart of the storm, in the heart of darkness, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption, not just for Donald, but for the entire town of Willow Creek. Chapter 6: The Fractured Mirror. In the tense silence of the plateau, under the relentless downpour, Sheriff Reynolds slowly inched closer to Donald. Each step he took was measured, his voice a calm, steady presence in the chaos of the storm. "Donald, please," he implored. "Let's end this peacefully. You don't have to be alone in this." Donald's eyes, wild and unfocused, darted between Reynolds and the shelter where Emily cowered. The axe in his hand trembled, reflecting his internal struggle. Memories flashed across his face, glimpses of happier times, now tainted by the tragedy that had consumed his life. Emily, her small frame shaking with fear, peered out from the shelter. Her eyes met Donald's, and in them, he saw not just fear, but also confusion and a plea for compassion. It was a look that pierced the shroud of madness that had enveloped him. Deputy Clark and the other volunteers held back, giving Reynolds space to negotiate. They watched, hearts in their throats, as a scene that would decide the fate of Donald, Emily, and perhaps the entire town of Willow Creek unfolded before them. "Donald," Reynolds continued, his voice a soothing balm in the storm, "think of your family. They wouldn't want this for you. You can still make things right." A tear mingled with the rain on Donald's cheek, the first sign of the man who had been lost to grief and madness. His grip on the axe loosened, and for a moment, it seemed as if he would surrender. But then, a flash of lightning illuminated the scene, casting monstrous shadows. Donald flinched, the sudden light igniting the fear and paranoia that had driven him into the woods. With a guttural cry, he raised the axe, the storm echoing his anguish. "No, Donald!" Reynolds shouted, but it was too late. Donald swung the axe with a ferocity born of his tormented soul, aiming not at the sheriff, but at the tree that stood like a silent sentinel beside the shelter. The axe struck the tree with a resounding thud, and Donald's cry turned into a sob. He dropped to his knees, the weapon falling from his hands, his body racked with sobs. The rage had left him, leaving behind only a broken man, haunted by his loss. Sheriff Reynolds rushed to Emily, wrapping her in a protective embrace. The volunteers moved in, cautiously securing Donald, who offered no resistance. His eyes, once filled with madness, now gazed emptily at the storm-ravaged sky. As they led Donald away, the rain began to lessen, the storm's fury abating as if in recognition of the tragedy that had unfolded. Emily was reunited with her mother, their tears of relief and joy a stark contrast to the sorrow that enveloped Donald. The town of Willow Creek would never be the same after that night. The shadow of the event would linger long in the hearts of its residents. They had come face to face with the depths of human despair and the fragile line between sanity and madness. In the days that followed, as Donald faced the consequences of his actions, the town slowly began to heal. But the memory of the man who had once been a friend and neighbor, now a symbol of their darkest fears, remained etched in their minds. The story of Donald, the axe murderer of Willow Creek, became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the human capacity for both good and evil, and the thin line that separates the two. Chapter 7: Shadows Never Sleep. The days following the harrowing events in Willow Creek were laden with a heavy stillness. The town, once a hub of warm community life, now lay under a blanket of unease. While the physical storm had passed, the storm in the hearts of Willow Creek's residents continued to rage silently. In the center of this turmoil was Donald, now confined under heavy security at a state psychiatric facility. The once respected townsman faced a stark future, confined to the sterile walls that echoed with the whispers of his fractured mind. Sheriff Reynolds, burdened by the weight of recent events, visited Donald, seeking some semblance of closure. He found a man who was a shadow of his former self, his gaze distant, lost in a labyrinth of his own tormented thoughts. Yet, in the depths of those eyes, there flickered a spark of something unnerving, a smoldering ember that refused to be extinguished. Back in Willow Creek, life struggled to regain its normal rhythm. Emily, the young girl who had been the catalyst for the town's nightmare, remained a silent, withdrawn shadow of her former self, her eyes betraying the trauma she had endured. The townsfolk, once divided in their views of Donald, now shared a collective apprehension. Discussions were had, plans were made, but the undercurrent of fear was palpable, a fear that what had happened could happen again. As weeks turned into months, the memory of the horrors began to fade, giving way to the mundane routines of daily life. But the scars remained, hidden beneath the surface, festering in the silence of the night. Then, one fateful evening, a chilling news broadcast shook Willow Creek to its core. Donald had escaped from the psychiatric facility. In a calculated and brutal act, he had overpowered a guard, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. The news spread like wildfire, reigniting the embers of fear that had never truly been extinguished. The town was thrown into a state of high alert, the specter of Donald's return looming like a dark cloud. Sheriff Reynolds, feeling a personal responsibility for the safety of the town, organized search parties and coordinated with state law enforcement. But there was a part of him, a dark, gnawing suspicion, that Donald had never intended to return to Willow Creek. Donald, now a fugitive, haunted by the demons of his past and the ghosts of his actions, disappeared into the shadows of the world. His fate became a mystery, a lingering question mark in the story of Willow Creek. The town, once a haven of tranquility, had been irrevocably changed. Parents clutched their children a little tighter, neighbors looked upon one another with a hint of suspicion, and the night no longer held the promise of peace, but the threat of lurking horrors. As the story of Donald, the axe-wielding madman of Willow Creek, spread beyond the town's borders, it became a tale of terror, a warning of the darkness that can reside in the human heart. And in the quiet moments, when the night was still, the residents of Willow Creek would wonder, with hushed breath and fearful hearts, where Donald was, and when the shadows would come to life once more.